Good morning, everyone. This is the Managing Your Community Stimulus Money webinar. It looks like we're just a couple minutes past 10, so I think we can get started. This webinar has been sponsored by the American Water Works Association of Michigan section, Michigan Water Environment Association, Michigan Rural Water Association, with a special thank you to the Michigan Municipal League and Michigan Township Association for helping promote today's webinar. And again, we'll get started here. We have some housekeeping information for everyone. I think you all saw that this webinar will be recorded, so we just want everybody to be aware of that. All attendees have been muted. There is the chat feature, which you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, a little box that says chat if you have questions during the presentation. I'll also be posting some links to some of the websites that we're referencing. There will be Q&A time after each speaker. The presentation will be approximately 1 hour with time for additional discussions at the end. And the slides will be sent in a follow-up email after the event. Okay. And my name is Sally Duffy. I'm going to do the introduction and help moderate today's webinar. I'm a senior project engineer at Hubbell Roth & Clark and former co-chair of MWA-MIAWWA Joint Asset Infrastructure Management Committee and a member of the AWWA Local Sections Education Council. In fact, all three speakers today are members of that council, and we got together and thought we'd help provide some timely information to our members here on the stimulus money. After the brief introduction, Ian Robinson will be the next speaker. And Ian has been the managing director of Blue Conduit since 2019. Blue Conduit is a water analytics company that has developed cutting-edge predictive machine learning methods to resolve uncertainties around service line material composition and empowers local officials with the information to efficiently remove lead service lines. The team began guiding Flint's lead service line replacement in 2016. Ian co-authored a white paper with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators on principles for using statistical modeling in service line inventory and replacement. And as I mentioned, is also a member of the Education Council. After Ian's presentation, Dawn Lund will be presenting on rate structure considerations when using your stimulus funding. Dawn is Vice President of Utility Financial Solutions and has over 25 years experience in financial analysis for utility systems. She is on the AWWA National Rates and Charges Committee, Finance, Accounting and Management Controls Committee, and contributing author to AWWA's upcoming M1 Manual 8th edition on rate structures. So welcome everyone today, and we'll go ahead and get started. I thought it might be helpful to understand what we were referring to when we say stimulus money. Obviously, there's been a whole lot of programs in response to COVID. There's also some pending legislation in, for supporting a large infrastructure bill currently under consideration. This is a little separate from this. This is specific to some funding that was allocated as part of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, which was signed into law in March of this year. Under that law, coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds were established, and these were designed to support various levels of governments to respond to the economic and public health impacts of COVID-19 and to contain impacts on their communities, residents, and businesses. This funding is administered by the U.S. Department of Treasury. Okay, next slide, please. And again, there's a lot of alphabet soup here. So the SLFRF, or ARPA, has some statutory eligible uses. These were laid out in the law. They indicate the funding should be for providing funding for the response to the COVID-19 public health emergency or negative economic impacts that resulted from that. It has an option to provide essential workers premium pay or grants, providing funding to offset reductions in revenue to local governments, And the focus of today's webinar is the last item, which is necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. We're not going to be dwelling on broadband, but the concepts probably apply to those sorts of investments as well. Next slide, please. There's some currently available guidance, and I'm going to post that in the chat here in a minute. The Treasury's interim final rule is effective May 17th. And that's currently out to the public for comment. So they're still receiving comments on that rule, and then they will publish the final rule. I think the comment period ends in a few days or next week. So we would expect the final rule to be presented soon after that. The US Treasury has also published a compliance and reporting guidance document at the end of June. And again, we'll provide the link for that. But much of today's presentations will have information related to those documents. Next slide, please. So the program priorities specific to infrastructure project selection, the final interim rulemaking included priorities for selecting potential infrastructure projects. And they wanted to prioritize quick projects that could be done very quickly. So they are using the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund eligibility. If your project would be eligible for that type of funding, it's automatically eligible for funding through this program. They also want to be acknowledging the critical role water systems play in protecting public health, replacing lead service lines associated with negative lifelong impacts. They feel that the lead service line replacement ties in with the protection of public health. They want to assist systems most in need according to state affordability criteria based on the impact that COVID's had on more disadvantaged communities. They're encouraging projects that improve resiliency to the effects of climate change. For us in Michigan, that's probably a lot of coastal erosion, but also these unusual rain events and flooding that's occurred recently. Encouraging projects unlikely to be made using private sources of funds, and supporting consolidation or establishment of drinking water systems. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to touch on the role of asset management due to the involvement of the committee. Most water and wastewater systems were required to develop asset management programs or plans through regulations from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE. These plans required the community to develop 5 and 20-year capital improvement plans that were prioritized based on reducing overall business risk. And so many of these communities already have a list of eligible projects in the water and wastewater prioritized. It's a great list to start with if you have some funding and you're looking for opportunities to use it to protect your community. Next slide, please. This is just an example of one community that went back to revisit their asset management plans, and they pulled out some of the projects that were included in those 5 and 20-year capital improvement plans. Something like combining failing water wells. You can see it checks off a few of the priorities met by the ARPA project goals. Lead water service line replacements obviously checks a number of boxes as well. Those are usually in areas with affordability issues. Sewage retention tank collection system I&I removal program. Again, I think that would be considered as a project that would offset the impacts of climate change due to varying rainfall amounts, as well as like an SSO reduction project. So just one example of how you might want to pull out some projects from your asset management plans and look to see which of these goals you can demonstrate are met by those projects. And I think now, I believe we're going to do a couple of quick polls. One is going to be checking out who we've got coming here and how you heard about us. So I'm going to ask AWWA to launch that poll. What best describes your current role? Are you in city management, administration? Are you a water, wastewater, public works person, a consultant, or other? I can't vote, but everyone is welcome to vote. It'll help us understand better who all's at today's webinar. I see we have about 63 participants, so we appreciate the great turnout from everyone. And we'll give you just another minute to complete that poll. All right, so we have, it looks like primarily consultants, 40% of them, some water and wastewater public works folks. We're glad to see we have 10% participation from city management administration, and then 20% other. Very good. Stacy, if you could launch the next poll, I'd appreciate it. I think we want to know how you heard about us. And how did you hear about today's webinar? Again, we had a number of sponsors here: MIAWWA, Michigan Water Environment Association, Michigan Rural Water Association, and then some other folks helped us promote it. So this is helpful information for us to understand how you heard about us and how we might get in touch if we have additional information we'd like to share with you folks. So we'll give you another minute to respond to that. And very good. And it looks like most of us are from MIAWWA, which is great. A little bit from the other groups and a number of others. So I appreciate that. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ian Robinson. So just give us a minute to transition. He'll start sharing his presentation. Thank you. I guess before we do that, if anybody has any questions on anything presented, I know it was just introductory, but you can post them in the chat. And then I'll try to respond, but I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Ian.
Thank you, Sally. If you can, perfect. And then here we go. Well, thank you so much, Sally, and thank you so much to everybody for joining. I'm just going to run through a couple of slides here when it comes to the American Rescue Plan, some of the requirements for cities as they're using the funds, thinking about using the funds and for what purposes, and then getting into some of what makes sense as a mentality or the right way to think about the use of these funds to best benefit your communities. And then I'll turn it off to Dawn, who will go into more detail about that. So this was already covered a little bit, but just to highlight what within the statutory available or eligible uses for American Rescue Plan funds for communities are one, addressing public health or negative impacts from the coronavirus, providing premium pay to essential workers, making up for revenue loss due to coronavirus impacts. And then the final one is investments in water, sewer, and broadband, which will be the bulk of what the groups on this call are going to be interested in. Next slide here. So just what are some of the trends that we're seeing in how communities have already decided or are thinking about using their stimulus funds? And we're thinking about backfilling budget shortfalls, environmental protection, providing premium pay to essential workers, transportation infrastructure, water and sewer infrastructure as well. And I think when you look at these spending trends, what jumps out is that they are short-term investments that are often one-time uses of funding to meet a specific need, acute need at the time, or a one-time use of funding that pays long-term benefits when it comes to something with a high fixed cost and a low marginal ongoing cost, where you look at some of those infrastructure investments. And I think those are the kinds of mindsets as we think about what is the best use for this funding to help communities best leverage this opportunity. So before we get too much into that, I want to kind of break down some of the requirements for communities in terms of reporting about the use of funding and what they're going to need to do. So for any community that is receiving, almost all communities that are receiving funding will need to submit a report by August 31st. Their interim report to the Treasury Department with how they plan on using the funding by the expenditure categories. The Treasury guidance that Sally had referenced, gives a long list of different eligible categories. And by August 31st, communities need to identify or indicate how they plan on using those funds. And then depending on the size of the community, the reporting requirements vary after that. For larger communities or those that have received more than $5 million in the stimulus funding, they will need to send in a quarterly project and expenditure report, which outlines each of the projects that they plan on using the funding for and progress towards completing those. For smaller communities, those reports will only need to be done annually. And then larger communities will need to put together annually a recovery and performance report as well. That's not required for smaller communities. And so when thinking about what are the relevant expenditure categories for groups on this call, to think about, while most of them appear in the infrastructure kind of category of uses, and a lot of these align with the Clean Water Revolving Fund or the Drinking Water Revolving Fund uses, and that's kind of what Sally had been talking about. In addition, there are a couple other categories that I think utilities and communities want to think about when it comes to wastewater and drinking water. One is within negative economic impacts, there's a household assistance direct to households that have been negatively impacted by coronavirus economically, to provide utility aid to those households. And then additionally, in the services to disproportionately impacted communities, lead remediation is another eligible use of funding and an expenditure category. That includes sources of lead that include lead paint and other sources, not specifically lead service lines, which falls under that category, but also falls under one of the infrastructure drinking water categories as well. So that's kind of what the funds can be used for. But I think as we transition towards Dawn's presentation, it's important to think about kind of what is a mindset or way of thinking about what is the best way of using these funds so that they provide the greatest benefit and do not create a long-term funding, unsustainable funding commitment for a community. So really it's thinking about what is a compelling argument for why this project makes sense for a one-time use of funding that can drive long-term impact and does not burden with unsustainable funding commitments. So kind of digging down deeper into that question, thinking about each of the projects or each of the uses of funding is this a funding of a project that has a high initial fixed cost that has a low marginal cost? Because this kind of funding through the stimulus is not something that is going to repeat. So making sure that you don't have that the projects that you're investing in do not carry long-term maintenance cost is important. Is this project addressing a short-term need that will have a long-term impact? Is another way of thinking about this, because if you can hit an acute need right now with this use of funding that has a long-term benefit for the community, then that's another great way of thinking about it. And the last one, which summarizes a little bit, is if successfully implemented, is there an ongoing funding commitment? And if there is, how would that be paid for? And so I think those are the kinds of mindsets when thinking about the use of this funding that we should be thinking about. And as Dawn goes through her section, I think this will help guide communities in thinking about what makes sense for how to use this funding to get the biggest bang for your buck. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I think we have another poll question at this point we'll put out. Stacy, if you can go ahead and post the poll question we have, and Dawn's loading up her presentation. How does your community currently plan to spend the stimulus money? You can check as many as apply. These were the 4 main categories from the rulemaking guidance. And I know some communities have had public outreach or an input opportunities where folks came and said, here's how we should spend the money. Others are probably have some projects already prioritized are going to spend. I'd also like to give folks an opportunity to ask any questions at this point you may have for Ian. I don't see any pending questions. Again, the chat is really the best way to do that. And I did go ahead and put the links to the rulemaking, the guidance document, as well as the list of recipients, who all is getting the funding and what amounts. There's a link to that in the chat as well. The chat, again, is the little button. If you run your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little menu pop up if it's not already there, and you can see the chat. Okay, let's close that poll and see what our results are. Oh, it looks like a vast majority. Maybe we've got a curated audience here, but it looks like the vast majority are planning to spend some, at least, on water and wastewater, as well as other needs. So that's interesting to note, and appreciate that poll. And with that, unless there's any questions, we'll turn it over to Dawn.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sally. Thank you so much, Ian. And thank you everyone for being on the call today. I really appreciate it. We wanted to bring this webinar to you, obviously talking about managing your community stimulus money. And my part in this is I really want to talk about an overall financial planning and how stimulus money fits into that. As a consultant, I'm getting those types of questions. How should our stimulus money fit into that? So I think it's really important to talk about some key financial targets, how they work together, and how stimulus money can fit into that picture. So I'm going to talk today about kind of an overall look about financial health, how stimulus money can fit into that, some pros and cons of the way people are possibly viewing their stimulus money. And coupled with this, it's really important. I'm going to touch on some capital planning and cash reserve policies. Those, the stimulus money is coming mainly directly from the pandemic, the results of the pandemic. And those that have fared the best through the pandemic are those that have really strong cash reserve policies. So I do have some slides on that today. Maybe it's a wake-up call for some communities, to know what are the needs of the water and wastewater utility. Do we have enough cash on hand for the financial risks that those utilities face? So I'm going to talk about cash reserve policies today and kind of show you how all this fits together and how stimulus funding can fit into that as well. But we're seeing from working with clients and getting some of the questions we're getting, certainly there's some short and long-term positive effects and benefits that will come out of this, the stimulus funding. But there also can be some negative impacts. And really, in my opinion, I think it's the way the stimulus funding is viewed. How are you viewing this money? Is this an opportunity for you to do those capital improvements that are desperately needed? Or is this an opportunity for you to sort of give back to your ratepayers? And although that giving back isn't on the list that both Sally and Ian reviewed, certainly from an accounting standpoint, there's sort of shell games, if you will, that can be played to use this money in different ways. Certainly, I'm advising, following the guidelines, but I'm going to get into a couple slides of some communities that have questioned possibly using this money for a rate decrease, and we'll get into that later in the presentation. Communities across the country, of course, are getting funds from the American Rescue Plan Act, and I know Sally sent out the link. You can actually look up your community, this link here, and see what type of allocation your community is getting. But it's basically $65 billion of direct and pretty flexible funding to American communities. And what I want to emphasize is that the Water and Wastewater Department isn't guaranteed money. What happens is that money goes to the community and the community decision makers managing that community, and they will then distribute it from there for their greatest needs. I'm assuming for what they feel are their greatest needs. So if you're a community administrator on the phone, you probably know what your needs are, but if you're a water and wastewater, if you're part of the water and wastewater department, it's probably really important for you to voice those needs. You know what kind of needs you have, what type of infrastructure needs you have. So it's time to speak up and make sure that if you have an opportunity to get some of that funding filtered down to the water and wastewater department, it's a good time to speak up and you have a good chance of getting some of that. I have this slide up here. We've already kind of been through this. What I'm going to talk about today is mainly investment in water and wastewater infrastructure, the financial planning for that, how the key targets work together, pros and cons of using that funding. But there's that 35-page document. I think you have a link to that. Ian went over some of the details of that, but there's spending deadlines, reporting requirements, uses of the money that they have a guidance for. So review that. And of course, each community is unique in their situation and needs. The presentation I'm going to go through today, they're real life examples and real life questions that I've been getting about the stimulus money, but you have to assess your own community, your own needs, your own situation. And of course, there's exceptions to everything I say today. So hopefully you guys all walk away with some piece of something today that can be helpful in guiding you in your stimulus money use. We talked about, we're going to talk mainly about investment in water infrastructure. Capital planning obviously is a very important piece of that. And as Sally has said, many communities have probably already developed their asset management plan. But the capital improvement plan is going to be really important when you think about the use of your stimulus money. Hopefully, each of you have at least a 5-year capital improvement program that has put assets in critical order. What are our most critical needs? And those assets are most likely the best candidates for stimulus funding. But what's important here is oftentimes when I'm consulting or teaching a class, I'll see discussions between accounting and engineering on that capital plan. Accounting knows what the community can afford, what the utility can afford, but engineering knows what can be done, what needs to be done in the system, engineering or system ops. So this is actually a perfect opportunity for you to work together, get that asset management plan created or updated, look at those critical needs, and work with the accounting department or finance department and figure out how you can best disperse any funds that would come to the water and wastewater utility. If you don't have a capital plan, and there are utilities out there without a capital plan, it's probably a good time to start thinking about that, start creating one. And of course, if you don't have someone right on hand that can help you do that, you can also have a good idea is a placeholder is reserving at least depreciation. So if you open up your financial statement, your income statement, you'll see a line item on there called depreciation. And for today's purposes, let's just say that's $500,000. If you don't have a capital plan, you can at least as a placeholder until you get that solidified, hold about $500,000. One yearly depreciation expense can help at least get you something reserved. So when you do have that capital improvement program in place, you've got some funds there to do that. Of course, this is just a proxy I'm giving you, but that can be age dependent. If your system's quite old or aged, you might want to reserve a little bit more than depreciation, but that's a good start. At least it gives you something to strive for while you're finishing that capital plan. When we talk about capital planning and also really stimulus funding, what is it? Stimulus funding is obviously cash. It's an infiltration of cash that's coming to you. So while we're talking about capital planning, I do want to talk about cash reserve policies. This can actually help guide if you're an administrator out there and your community has many needs. A cash reserve policy in your enterprise funds can actually help guide to tell you who is in the most need of the stimulus funding. So I want to talk a little bit about cash reserve policies. I had said before, the stimulus funding is a direct relationship to the pandemic. those who've had strong cash reserve policies have fared the best. They had the cash available to fall back on in the short term to keep the system and the things going that needed to be done. So it's probably a good wake-up call along with the stimulus funding to update or produce a cash reserve policy. Oftentimes I get questions, why do utilities need cash on hand? We're supposed to not make profit, and so we shouldn't have any cash on hand, but that's not true. There's a lot of financial risk to water and wastewater funds, and we need to ensure we have funds available to pay that O&M expense. And I loved Ian's term, budget backfilling. This is one area that if you're lacking due to the pandemic, you can use those funds to sort of budget backfill. Another idea here is I get a lot of questions about delinquencies. What do we do with delinquencies? If I just write them off, it's not fair to the other ratepayers. So in my opinion, the stimulus funding would be a good area to maybe help with some of those delinquencies, because actually budget assistance, utility assistance is right on that first line item of the 4 line items we saw. So think about that. Maybe if the water and wastewater utilities are facing high delinquencies due to the pandemic, those funds could be used for that as well. But also we want to fund unanticipated cost contingencies. If we have a main break, whatever it may be, we need cash on hand to do that. There's risks to the utility. We, of course, always want to be able to pay our debt payment, and we want to be able to fund those system improvements. That's another reason, AWWA National actually just came out with cash reserve policy guidance in 2018. But for years, it's been important, even prior to that, important to set that cash reserve policy for these funding requirements. In my opinion, that's why water and wastewater utilities are finding themselves struggling. Now we haven't set those rates where they need to be, and ensure that we're funding that minimum amount of cash. But assuming your water or wastewater department does get that influx of cash from the stimulus funding, what is the best way to handle that? And budget backfilling, I like that term. We can, again, use it for that. But I also want to get into water and wastewater infrastructure. How does that work with the 3 key targets working together when we interject that stimulus funding? So it's important. Does your utility, to start off, does your utility even know how much cash they should hold according to their financial risks? That's the first step in how to determine how to distribute the stimulus funding. A formal cash reserve policy. What does it really do? Well, boards, councils, ratepayers may not understand why we need cash on hand. And so it identifies those risk areas. And of course, that capital improvement program is part of that. It provides a detailed description of the methodology of why we need that minimum cash. And it holds boards and councils accountable to maintain those cash reserve levels in the future. Why a formal policy? Well, we're trying to identify a minimum. And again, this can help guide how much water, wastewater may need of the stimulus fund. We look at the minimum amount of cash those utilities are holding, and we can work towards that minimum with this funding, with budget backfilling, with preparing for that capital improvement program. But our cash should be allowed to be above that minimum. And of course, the age of the system will drive that, and the capital improvement program. Sometimes I get asked, how much is too much cash for the utility to hold? And I bring that up in today's webinar because I'm getting some questions on utilities that want to give back stimulus money to ratepayers. Those that have planned well in the past to have cash available, and feel like maybe the best use of that money is giving back to ratepayers. And even if you haven't planned well in the past, I'm getting a lot of questions about, can we give the stimulus money back to our ratepayers? Well, in general, if you're a utility out there feeling like you've got enough cash on hand, or too much cash on hand, or you're getting criticism and you as an administrator are getting pressure to give this stimulus money cash back as a rate decrease. Maybe you're worried about rate affordability and you're getting pressure. There's many reasons that you may have cash on hand other than quote unquote overcharging your customers. Some of the questions you want to be asking are you investing enough in the system? That refers back to that strong 5-year capital improvement program. Also, are you over borrowing when you should be cash flowing from operations? So if you're faced right now with cash that you're getting criticism, maybe you have enough cash, and so that stimulus funding should be used as a refund. I'm going to show you a couple slides on, there are other key financial targets you can affect if you're considering a rate decrease. This, I won't go into too much detail here. This I wanted you to have, since I'm telling you it's important now with this stimulus funding opportunity to establish that minimum amount of cash you should reserve. This is the basic formula we usually follow. We look at your O&M expense and we reserve your risk factor associated to that is between 12 and 25%. How we determine that is related to your billing cycle. If you bill your customers, you're waiting for that cash to come in. They send them the payment in, you deposit the payment. It's about a 45-day working capital lag for a utility that bills monthly. So if you take 45 days, divide it by 365 days in a year, you get 12.3%. That's the lower end of this risk spectrum. The higher end is many water and wastewater utilities bill every 90 days quarterly. And so 25% would handle that. Historical investment in system, we look at the age of your system, the likelihood of equipment failure, main breaks, whatever it may be. So we need cash on hand for that. Obviously, we need cash on hand for your annual debt payment. And of course, for that 5-year capital improvement program. If you say you're going to spend $500,000 next year on your capital improvement program, I want you to have the funds available at the beginning of the construction year to make that happen. So when we go through this whole process for this particular utility, this methodology says this utility should reserve about $8 million. And for ease of, to simplify the policy and to know what water and wastewater fund may need to help guide on how much of the stimulus funding might be appropriate for those departments, we can actually convert that into a more simplified policy. In this example, this utility spends about $19 million in annual expenses. The minimum cash reserve we calculated was about $8 million. We simply divide the 19 by the 8 million and you get a factor of 2.4. And then we take 365 days in a year divided by that 2.4 and you get 152 days cash on hand this utility should hold as a minimum. Again, this is a strong starting point to determine what each water and wastewater or your other enterprise funds need to then look at your stimulus funding, and it might help guide you on how to disperse that throughout the community. But there are other key targets to talk about. It's easy to think about cash only right now, and I'm going to show you some examples that happen when we look at cash only. Stimulus money is, of course, an influx of cash, but there are other key targets that work together for a long-term financially sustainable utility. I mean, one of Ian's points was, sure, this is an influx of cash that we can use immediately, but we need to be thinking of how do we benefit all of our ratepayers in the long term. It's not just how do we benefit our ratepayers today? What can we do to our infrastructure and those things that are future ratepayers and our long-term financial sustainability and future generations will benefit from the stimulus money. So the other two key targets I want to talk about, and they're really critical. Many utilities in Michigan and beyond hold debt in the water and wastewater area. And all a debt coverage ratio is it's one financial target to measure along with cash to determine how healthy the utility is. But all debt coverage ratio does is it identifies the amount of cash generated from operations on a yearly basis in order to pay your debt service payment. Notice I didn't say how much cash do I have on hand. It's, am I generating enough from operations to pay my debt service payment at least 1.25 times? And you're going to see an example of that and how stimulus money fits into that, fits with debt coverage ratio, and how important that is to look at that. Debt coverage ratios are mandated in your, or it's a covenant in your bond ordinance. So if you do have a revenue bond outstanding debt, you've got this information on what your minimum needs to be. Typically, it's a 1.25. But what's important to note here is if you're not meeting this debt coverage ratio, even if you're making your debt payment, you're technically in default. And that has long-term consequences on when you go to reissue debt in the future, which is really important. We've got a lot of capital needs in the water and wastewater utility. We want to be able to issue debt when we need to, and we want to be able to issue it at the lowest rate possible. If you're a utility that hasn't shown good past performance on this debt coverage ratio in the past, you're going to be considered higher risk, and higher risk leads to a higher interest rate for that bond. So it has long-term effects for your ratepayers and for your financial planning when we don't have a healthy debt coverage ratio. So you want to know your requirements and calculate them with your budget process. I'm going to talk about one other key target, then I'm going to roll this all together and show you some proper financial planning techniques and how to look at these targets. And then I want to show you some stimulus funding beware examples. So maybe if you're tempted to use stimulus money in a different way, I want to point out some beware ideas. So another key target is rate of return, or simply for today's purposes, just think about it as you collect revenues as a utility, you have expenses as a utility. So revenues less expenses, hopefully that number is something positive. If you're operating as a positive, that's called a net income or a positive operating income. If that number's negative, you're operating at a loss. And obviously, when we're operating at losses, we're not funding everything we should be funding in the system. And what does that lead to? That leads to lack of capital reinvestment, most likely in the future. Because I'm not funding the things I should be funding today, I most likely won't have the cash on hand to fund that into the future. So I'm going to talk about a case-based real example before stimulus funding. And this is a project we just recently completed. And what this showed here was this utility, we're planning over a 5-year period for them. And they wanted to not have a rate increase in the 2021 fiscal year, coming right off the pandemic. We saw quite a bit of that in the utility departments trying to hold back that rate increase. Of course, that has long-term implications doing that, but we did see that. So these are the 3 key targets that I talked about today. And real briefly, I'll just again tell you why each of these are important. Operating income, if I'm meeting my operating income target every year, that means I'm fully funding everything I should be funding in the system. I'm getting my O&M expenses, I'm getting the depreciation that I need to be able to fund that, to replace my equipment in the future. And this example, this utility held rates, no rate increase for 2021, but then they needed to follow up with 4.9% rate adjustments after that. Now, their goal here was they had a healthy cash balance, which they were preparing for this aggressive capital improvement program. So that cash balance was justified, but their goal was to spend it down at least by half, almost meeting their minimum cash target we wanted to have. And in order to do that, they also needed to borrow $4 million in order to, they were able to fund the capital improvement program in the early years, and then they needed to borrow. So the last key target that I talked about was that debt coverage ratio, measurement of debt affordability. We wanted it to be something above a 1.25, obviously, and they were in the 1.3, so they were healthy. So this was the picture before stimulus funding, before they knew they were going to get stimulus funding. And this would have guided the three key targets, would have guided them into long-term sustainable health. Now, these 4.9% rate increases might sound scary, but when you look at the dollar impact, typically for water and wastewater, it's not a huge dollar impact. But after after we got that program completed for them, what happened is the stimulus funding announcement came out, and the question becomes, how should we use it? Each community is unique, like I said, in their needs. And some water and wastewater utilities will get none of this money. Their community leaders believe there are greater community needs. That's one reason, again, I said make your voices heard. Make sure that you're reviewing with the community leaders what you need. And if you are our community leader, maybe reach out to that utility department. Make sure they've got that solid capital improvement program, that cash reserve policy, so it can help actually guide you on where to put the money. Some communities, have desperately needed this money. They have capital needs. It's going to give them that boost that they need. A capital improvement project that's in critical need, they didn't have the cash for. Maybe they're not even healthy enough to borrow for. It's going to give that community the boost. They know how to spend this money. Some communities, though, have already planned and they say, yeah, this is great money, but we're in pretty good financial shape. I've seen both of these situations kind of feel obligated to give the stimulus money back to the ratepayer. We're just coming off the pandemic, people are struggling. Maybe we should give this money back to the ratepayer. And again, that is not what the money was intended for. There are guidelines. You've got that link in your chat box. There are guidelines to follow. But of course, unfortunately, there's probably shell games that are probable. For example, we can say, all right, we're going to take that stimulus money, we're going to put it in our capital improvement fund. We're going to label it as capital improvement fund. But now we've got this other cash on hand operating fund that we did have on hand for that capital improvement fund, so we can spend down our O&M fund, our regular operation and cash fund. I'm not recommending that. I'm just saying that certainly there are shell games that can be played, and we need to bring this to your attention because I had originally in the presentation said it's depend how this money is viewed, how the long-term sustainable benefits of the stimulus money can be. So I want to show you a couple examples of that because I am getting questions on what happens if we have a rate decrease. And so that's stimulus funding beware. In this example, community, the water department was getting $3 million in stimulus funding. And of course, there's an urge to give back to the ratepayer through a rate decrease. And a couple things on rate decreases. One, the glory is always short-lived. You might announce a rate decrease, but typically it's never enough to really see a big dollar impact on your customers' bills. So it's really never enough. And you also almost always have to follow up with a rate increase in the future. So it's a very short-lived reward. And going back to Ian's discussion, how can we find ways to invest in infrastructure or use the stimulus money that people benefit in the longer term? So if we just use the stimulus money as a rate decrease in 1 year, those customers are benefiting in this year. But most likely, we have to follow up with rate increases beyond that. So we're not getting that multi-generational, if you will, stimulus funding benefit that it's intended for. Another question, and I'm going to show you examples of these and how they affect the three key targets. But when we discussed a rate decrease, and I had said my concerns about the rate decrease, their question was, okay, how about if we just hold rates steady for as long as we can and spend down $3 million? And what happens with that is typically, and I'm going to show you this, that usually results in double-digit increases. Let's say we use the stimulus money and we can hold our rates steady for 4 years. Probably in that 5th year, we're going to need a double-digit rate increase because our financials have deteriorated so much. We need that double-digit rate increase to get back on track. And if a community is having a hard time putting smaller inflationary needed rate increases through today, they're certainly going to struggle with that double-digit rate increase needed 5 years from now. And so we've deteriorated the financial position of the utility such that we need this double-digit rate increase, but we're certainly going to try to avoid that when that time comes. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. In this example, this utility wanted to spend down $3 million in stimulus money by giving a decrease of 8%. So let's look at those key targets I talked about. Here's the decrease. And then this, I showed you that the base case before. And of course, they were theoretically needed to follow up with 4.9s in the original plan. So you can see here, operating income deteriorating. They should have an operating income if the ratepayers, the current ratepayers, are paying their fair share of the O&M expenses and the infrastructure being consumed, they would have an operating income of right around $800,000. You can see by having that using that stimulus money for a rate decrease, we're deteriorating our operating income position. Our current ratepayers aren't paying their fair share. And what does that mean? That means in the future, when I try to make that up and turn that target around, I'm going to have more aggressive rate increases. So now my future ratepayers are paying much higher rates. And again, that's not what the stimulus money is for. We need to look at that long-term multi-generational benefit. Our cash balance, you can see, we had an influx come in, it deteriorated back down to our original level. And this is the danger in only looking at cash. So when we talk about stimulus money, people are looking at cash only, tend to look at cash only. This is the danger of it. I actually have had several people ask me, what do you mean we can't have a rate decrease when we're getting free money? Surely we can, with that influx of money, we can pass that back to our customers. And this is what happens. You're able to stabilize that cash. You have an influx of money, but you're spending it down. It's probably stabilizing your cash. But here's even the most critical target, is that debt coverage ratio. Remember, debt coverage ratio is a measurement of debt affordability. If you don't meet your debt coverage ratio, it has long-term consequences. You're considered higher risk. And when you go to issue debt in the future, which if, as a water and wastewater system, we most likely, with that new asset management plan, have some aggressive spending we need in the future. We're most likely going to need to borrow. We need to meet that debt coverage ratio. And in this example, by having that rate decrease, this utility just put them in a long-term financial debt ratio situation. We're not even cash flowing enough from operations now to meet our debt coverage ratio one time. So that's going to have long-term consequences. So let's look at the utility. When I showed them that, they said, okay, let's hold rate steady. What about just holding rate steady and spending down that $3 million? And in this example, we held rate steady for 4 years. They would need a double-digit rate increase of 13%. I'm sure that utility would really struggle putting a 13% rate increase through. I'm spending my operating income, I'm starting to operate at losses. Water and wastewater utility is an enterprise fund. It's think of it kind of like almost like a business. Would you operate your business at a loss? You're certainly not funding the things you should be funding operating at a loss, and certainly not when you're also not meeting your minimum operating income target. Of course, we've spent down that cash to the level they wanted because we had that inflow coming in. And again, their debt coverage ratio is falling below the minimum. And remember, still in both circumstances, the utility needed to borrow still the $4 million to help fund this more aggressive capital improvement program. This improvement program came out of their asset management planning, which was an important tool to help guide them on how to spend the money they have on hand. So let's focus on financial planning and the best use of this stimulus money. when we look at how can we really use this, we can focus on the 3 key targets that I talked about. We can avoid that rate adjustment in this year that we had planned and follow up with smaller rate increases. Remember, I've added $3 million to my cash balance, which helped fund some of my capital improvements. So I've lowered my rate increase from 4.9% to 4.2% of what was needed. I've stabilized my operating income. I didn't put us in a position where my current ratepayers aren't paying their fair share. They're not quite up to my operating income target, but they're certainly contributing a fair share of that. Again, I've stabilized my cash, but look at here. Not only was I able to mitigate some of the rate increase that's going to benefit my current ratepayers and my ratepayers in the future, I also was able to borrow less money. That $4 million can turn into $1.5 million and benefit not only my ratepayers today by borrowing less, but benefit my ratepayers into the future by having less debt to equity on my system. So one of the key targets I talked about was that debt coverage ratio. You can see that by borrowing less, still having that smaller rate increase, and not delaying those rate increases, for the 4 years and not having a rate decrease, I'm meeting my debt coverage ratio. I've got a healthy debt coverage ratio target. That means in the future, when I go to fund a capital improvement program and I need to borrow, I'm most likely going to be considered a better risk utility, if you will, which also helps with the rating, with the interest expense, the interest rate that you would pay on your debt. So you don't get that immediate glory, but you definitely are being a responsible decision makers, and customers are benefiting into the future. So so we can look at the stimulus funding for long-term financial health, and it does help mitigate rates. They do benefit. We get that multi-generational benefit. In this example, this utility over time was able to have rates about 3% lower while keeping the system healthy. And they bonded for much less, $2.5 million less than what they had planned to borrow for. So let's talk about, this is my last slide here before we get into questions, but a summary of action. How do we best look at stimulus funding with financial planning? And you need to make your needs known. That's the number one. Your community members will be pulled in all sorts of different directions. So we need to review the needs of your water and wastewater department. Maybe they already know. But it's a good reminder, and it's a good look into that. How do we do that? We're going to look at that, updating and refreshing that capital improvement program. We're going to look at establishing or refreshing our minimum cash reserve policy. So it's also really an opportunity to put your money where your mouth is. As the saying goes, many communities are worried about water affordability. It's a concern across the country. This is the time to say, all right, this is an important enough topic that I can use this stimulus money for keeping the water and wastewater infrastructure funded properly and keeping rates as low as possible by using some of the stimulus money to do that. That capital improvement program, of course, we want to put that in critical order. Accounting and engineering should be working together. We also want to update that cash reserve policy. How much should you even hold unique to your utility's circumstances? If you don't know that today, it's going to be a little hard to determine how to appropriately use these funds. And of course, we want to understand how those key targets work together. This is not just a cash focus. Even though stimulus funding is cash, it's not a cash focus. We want to look at that debt coverage ratio. And of course, we want to prepare that multi-year financial plan and rate track that with future generations in mind. So with that, hopefully you walk away with a little bit of things to positives to do and how it can help you in the long term. But I did want to point out those negatives. I am getting quite a few calls on how can we give back the stimulus money to our community. And you are giving it back by properly financially planning in areas like water and wastewater, and replacing those critical needs infrastructure that customers today can benefit from and into the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sally. Maybe we have some questions. I'll stop sharing and turning this back over to Sally.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I really appreciate that. Stacy, I think we had one poll left. It was asking if we're planning to use your stimulus money for a rate decrease, if you can post that one. So if spending on water, wastewater, do you anticipate reducing customers' water and sewer rates? Obviously, Dawn gave a lot of reasons why not to do that, but maybe if you came in thinking that was something you wanted to do for your customers, we'd be interested to hear that. I haven't seen too many questions in the chat. And again, if you kind of hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little window or menu bar pop up that's got chat or Q&A. And so if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat. Also in the chat, I did post links to the various documents we've referenced. And this recorded presentation will be available for later viewing, and it'll be sent in an email along with the slides. So thank you, Eric, for that question. And we have our poll results. Yay, nobody's planning on reducing water and sewer rates. There's some undecided, and hopefully that Dawn gave you some consideration for that. A couple other things I just thought I'd mention is, there is other sources of funding available for your infrastructure. The most often leveraged in the state is the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds that provide low interest loans for eligible projects. There's often principal forgiveness involved in those types of funds, and those can be used for energy efficiency or communities with affordability issues, green projects, as it were, green principal forgiveness. Another program to keep an eye out for is the Michigan Clean Water Plan, and I'm going to post that link in the chat as well. There's already been some money dispersed, awarded from that program for drinking water funds. There's also potentially money available for wastewater side. It's still working its way through the budgetary process in the state. Potentially some more SAW funding for those who are familiar with that, where money was made available for asset management and design planning. And another link I'm going to share here is the low income, I clicked the wrong one here. Some people might be familiar with the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. It was called LIHEAP, and now there is a water version available. I personally have found that to have a bit of red tape associated with that, but I think they're working on removing that. It's to help offset delinquencies in water and sewer accounts. So LIHEAP. I'll post that link here shortly. I do see one question. It says, Ian stated that transportation infrastructure was a target. I don't believe roads and trails are. I think I'll have to double check on that in terms of transportation, but I think it's more coordinating transportation needs. Unfortunately, Ian had to leave. I agree with the question, the person asking the question, on transportation. I think those have to be linked to the water and wastewater. Dawn, do you know that off the top of your head?
I was just going to comment. Definitely, Ian should possibly answer his slide, but his slide was how, I think it was worded how he's seeing funds being used. And that actually leads to what was my point of making sure people understand the 3 key targets, because there's, of course, ways around of what it was intended for. So I think Ian's original slide said that's what he's seeing things being used for, not that necessarily it should be used for that.
Right. No, I think the transportation funding is largely going to be addressed in the potential infrastructure legislation that's being considered by the Biden administration running its way through Congress. So, yeah, I think we'll ask Ian to clarify that. Maybe we can include that answer in the follow-up. Any other questions? Okay. I appreciate everyone attending today, and hopefully you found this webinar at least helpful. I know Dawn presented a lot of information, but I've seen her presentation before, and it is interesting to work through the math to see where you end up with rates, because that is such a political topic, and something that most DPW and engineering folks are kind of up against is, you know, ensuring that people understand that their water and sewer rates are being spent in a very responsible way. So if there's no other questions. Yep, and I'll just remind you, a recording and a PDF of the presentations will be available via a follow-up email, which should be coming out about Monday. So thank you all for attending. On behalf of Michigan section of AWWA, Michigan Water Environment Association, and Michigan Rural Water Association, as well as Dawn and Ian, who volunteered their time today, we appreciate everybody attending. Thank you.